Now, in the mid-2020s, there are signs that the left is straining to reinvent itself. We hear somewhat less about identity, and quite a bit more about economics. The sudden calls for wealth taxes, rent controls, and raids on the fortunes of the dead have prompted many to speak of a post-woke left. Is wokeness being put away? And is the right at all well equipped to update its own operating system for the special threats of this century and for once to play politics to win? With me to discuss such matters is the writer and academic Neema Parvini, also known as Academic Agent. Neema Parvini, Academic Agent, welcome to The Forge.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So feel free to take issue with my framing throughout, but you could, I reckon you could broadly class the left into two categories at the moment. You have regime leftists, what we might call regime leftists. I'm thinking here people like Starmer, Blair, Nancy Pelosi. They tend to be ideologically more flexible than the other category that I'll get to in a moment, and politically disciplined. But then you have the what we might call insurgent leftist class that no doubt contains figures like Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, who are more devoted to a fixed ideological cause and therefore often less politically savvy. The interesting thing about so much of our civilizational life at the moment, I would suggest, is that both these categories seem to be retreating from what is colloquially, tediously described as wokeness nowadays in various ways. The first camp talking more about things like digital ID, mass surveillance. The second camp talking more about wealth taxes, raiding inheritance and all the rest of it. What should we make of these trends and developments in your view?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that we should have all seen them coming, as some people did. Me. I famously wrote an essay called Putting the Woke Away back in 2022, 2023. That's in the new book, Applied Elite Theory, if people are interested. But the whole reason I wrote that is because Tony Blair himself, who makes a habit of these rare interventions, I have to laugh because every time he says something, the press calls it a rare intervention. Says it every 4 weeks or so.
As if he's John Major.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But he's always in the press. But he basically told Labour when Starmer had already purged the Corbynistas, but before he was Prime Minister Starmer, he was giving them orders via newspaper articles saying, look, you have to tone down woke stuff, get that nonsense away, present yourself as the adults in the room. This is going to be a sensible government. So that was one thing. The other thing that triggered that article I wrote back then was actually a report that was done on US military recruitment. And also at the same time, British military recruitment were both down. And I mean, if you pay attention to the Telegraph, which I always look to for military matters, because it seems to be the newspaper they always choose to. They have been talking about this recruitment crisis for some time. And that paper that I wrote, which was that paper that I read back then, which was by some, American officer, was actually he was actually saying, why is recruitment down? Young men are checking out of the institutions. They don't think the system works for them. They're not being listened to. Too much is being made of DEI, all of the stuff that we know. So I said back then that it's not difficult if you have people at the top elite level, as Tony Blair almost certainly is, flagging these things up. Another person that I looked at was Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, who writes this annual letter to other CEOs. So the CEO of BlackRock then sends it to all of the other corporations, publishes it once a year. And that year, his letter was basically telling corporations, look, we need to go back to being apolitical, take politics out of it, back to business, back to basics. We're going to strip back all of this, the ERG stuff they were doing, and get back to basics because people are starting to, he said that in that letter. So for me, the signs were there that key decision makers had already seen that they needed to change trajectory. And I think that since then, there has been a massive toning down of woke. I think it's worth remembering where we were back in 2020. when people were being fired for simply not supporting BLM, as an example, when we were being told daily, barracked by, TV shows and movies. Do you remember that whole series, Dear White People?
Yes, yes.
Right. So there was a lot of very in-your-face, aggressive, polarizing wokery in that period. These days, you don't really get that. There's still some political correctness, and there's still some, obviously, at the moment they're calling Farage racist, blah blah blah, but it's nowhere near the fever pitch that it was, back in the peak summer of love 5 years ago. I've also noticed, I was watching some Royal Marine recruitment ads the other day, and they're just they're notable for being masculine, not particularly diverse, and so on. So the messaging where it counts, it has definitely changed from the military ads I was watching 5 years ago, which was saying, join the army and you'll be able to travel the world and see the sights. I honestly think one of the things behind this is the fact that NATO seems to be gearing up for some major conflict. What that is remains a mystery, I think, to everybody. Ostensibly it's Russia and China and Iran, but it really does seem that they need to get military recruitment up. So that's my feeling. Now, there has been two very significant leftist wins recently. I say wins. One was Mamdani in New York. That's just happened. The other one is Polanski, who seemed to come out of nowhere to take over the Green Party. And the left are very excited about that. In fact, there's been some polls showing the Greens above Labour. And so some people are saying, well, look, is this the return of wokery? Is this? But if you notice, this is very much left, what I describe as left populism. If you watch the Mamdani campaign, strip away all the nonsense people said about him being a jihadist and a communist and all that. His whole campaign was presenting himself as a regular Joe, just a New Yorker like one of you, and I care about the same things as you, the price of a hot dog and things like this. So he actually ran an effective, back to basics, left populist campaign. And I've noticed even the Greens have started to tone down, like the Green Party you expect to talk about climate change all the time. But in their messaging, I think they're very much using that Mamdani template here now, where, they have the correct right-on positions across the suite, but the messaging isn't woke, it's not in your face, it's more, we're just regular people, just the same as you, and we're going to, we're sick of these billionaires running everything. That's going to be, and I think that the left have been trending in that direction for some time. Novara Media, Aaron Bastani, and over in America, the Young Turks.
True, yes.
Their messaging has become a lot more populist and almost even, in some cases, MAGA friendly, you could say.
Certainly adjacent. So, I wonder, obviously so much of our analysis of the concept of putting woke away, which is the concept that you coined, of course, is depends on what we mean by woke, and this has been done to death in and of itself. So I'm sure we won't spend too long on it, but it does seem to me that too often people on the right, and in general actually, are inclined to associate wokeness with a set of behavioral techniques, whereas I view wokeness as more of not everyone gravitates towards the ideology of wokeness for exactly the same reason. I think there are different motives at work. But if we were to define wokeness as something like hyper-egalitarian demographic communism or something like that, and we were to regard its main pillars as being sort of a fetishization of minorities and a desire to deal a blow to sort of white-dominated society and all the rest of it, even though these activists on both the regime left and on the insurgent left, even though they're not being as in your face about that as they felt able to be, it seems, in the 2010s, when you get the sense that they just felt unassailable. They were also more in people's faces because things like HR were more important, were becoming more important because NGOs were becoming more important. This meant that everyday people couldn't avoid it as much. But nevertheless, what we might call the the sort of conceptual doctrines of wokeness, minoritarianism, anti-whiteness, all the rest of it, these remain pretty important litmus tests, even among these bands of leftists. I'll give you an example. When Mamdani was on the stage in New York City with Governor Cuomo, talking with Andrew Cuomo, talking about issues in New York, one of the ways in which Mamdani tried to trick Cuomo was by saying, "How many mosques have you been to in the city?" Which isn't a sign of them dropping it altogether. And again, I know it's low IQ slop in a way, but when Piers Morgan asks Zach Polanski, "Can a woman have a penis?" he still feels pressure to say yes. And so is it a matter of the woke being put away, or rather a matter of woke being soft-pedaled?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that the left have their own Motte and Baileys. If you remember, the wokery in its most virulent form wasn't actually egalitarian. It was a kind of inverse hierarchy, if you want to put it that way. You remember the progressive stack.
Yes.
And right at the top of the progressive stack, you have a disabled black lesbian or something,
yes.
right? And then you get fewer and fewer points.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere down here you've got a white gay man, but he still has some points because he's gay, right? Mm-hmm. And then right down at the bottom, almost as the untouchables in a case system, right?
Yes.
You have the pale, male, and stale white man, okay, right at the bottom. And that sense of that stack, which was aggressive and which got people's backs up and which was very unsuccessful as a ruling ideology, I would say, caused a significant and huge and sustained backlash, which is why still now Piers Morgan is, feasting off the fumes of it, even though he wrote a book called Woke is Dead. So they put that, and the most important thing, it was illiberal. Wokery in that form didn't come out of liberal ideology so much. It came out of postmodern, sometimes Marxist, sometimes kind of post-Marxist critiques of Western metaphysics at its most basic level. So, I mean, and then again, people will forget about this now, but at its height, people were talking about different forms of mathematics.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
We're going to do an indigenous mathematics.
Yes.
We're going to do a black mathematics.
Yeah. The idea was that we needed to challenge Western ways of knowing, which had been given undue privilege by virtue of the fact that white people were in a position to rig the world epistemically in their favor. Like you get all this sort of critical theory guff and Foucauldian guff sort of feeding into wokeness at an intellectual level. And you're right that seems to have disappeared. But I've always regarded wokeness as more of an emotional attitude, a kind of spasmodic attitude to things. So of course, the intellectual inputs matter. And as I say, you've got postmodernism, the French postmodernists, you've got the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, you've got a bit of Harvard legal theory baked into it because in its highly Americanized inflection. But is it not really more a basic attitude to the world whereby people say white men have been dominating things for far too long? They continue to dominate things in subtle, insidious ways. In the interests of securing social justice and erasing these corrigible human differences that are the product of social arrangements, they're not the product of nature, where there needs to be a sort of draconian curative onslaught against everything that straight white men have built. And I think that is where their intersectional hierarchy comes in. The reason why they have that intersectional hierarchy, which is the inversion of the kind of natural hierarchies against which they rail, some of them clearly do view it as a way of bringing the high low. There is that resentful attitude. So many of them are not ideologically consistent. But if you were to just study the ideology in a conceptual fashion, I think what they would say is that the reason why the intersectional hierarchy needs to exist, it's during the period of revolution when you're trying to equalize that you need to sort of overcorrect in order to get to that utopia.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, I've been studying the original Bolsheviks recently, as you may know.
I do know.
And there are parallels to be drawn. They're not exact, but you could say the aggressive form of wokery was a bit like Trotsky and his followers.
Yep.
And now this slightly more pragmatic form is more like Lenin or Stalin.
Yep. Genuinely.
Where you know, if you know anything about them, they weren't ideological purists to the extent that they weren't willing to make pragmatic decisions in the here and now. Sometimes you need to go backwards 2 steps in order to go forward 3 steps, and so on.
That's right.
And in a way, this Mamdani, Polanski new form of populist left, I think are doing a more pragmatic thing. They're changing their messaging, and maybe even dealing with some of the underlying, I guess, like psychotic traits. I mean, I know Lenin called it leftism an infantile disorder. Other writers have talked about this, where there's almost like a kind of monstrous like a left which is an abomination, which just that has bloodlust and wants to destroy and wants to kind of feel righteous fury and destroy its enemies and things like that.
Revenge itself upon God and nature and all the rest of it.
All of that. And that is a side of the left that the left themselves sporadically allow to bubble up, and then they put it away, or they tame it, or it's like, right, the time for that is over now, because if you keep on doing that, you're going to jeopardize the entire project. And I do think that is happening. I also think that these figures now, Polanski and Mamdani, are less radical, because I always look at foreign policy.
Right.
I always look at key questions, like, for example, NATO support. What's their stance on Ukraine? And it strikes me that for the British system, for the permanent bureaucracy, the ruling class here, they would prefer a Polanski to a Corbyn. Because Corbyn has always been a critic on core foreign policy issues, whereas, as far as I can tell, Polanski is, if he came to power,
not a huge amount would happen.
He would be at least a continuity prime minister
in that respect, at least.
On that respect, on like he's not going to like say, right, we're going to stop supporting Ukraine, which is ultimately, it seems to me, often what the structure cares about most. Whereas if Corbyn ever actually became the prime minister, I've often wondered, like, would they even allow it to happen? You know, or would we get other scenarios?
It's occurred to me of late. So you have written a whole book about elite theory. Applied elite theory is I suppose an update to that, or a practical update to the populist delusion, which was more of a sort of theoretical treatment of populism, where it goes wrong, how organized minorities always are bound almost by nature, certainly throughout history, have had much more clout than disorganized majorities, and populism bets on majorities having the wherewithal and the staying power to get things right continuously. It's just not really what majorities are able to do. It goes against the iron law about oligarchy and all the rest of it. But it seems to me that, so when you talk about Blair in the British context, and I suppose he would want us to say in the global context as well, he can in many ways be viewed as the creative figure who built the oligarchy. You could think of FDR in the same way in America. Strangely enough, oligarchies, in order to be successful, in order to get off the ground, they often do need monarchical figures who get things underway and up and running. So there's an immense amount of creativity in the first generation of an oligarchy. The problem is that oligarchs have people like Blair have as much of a succession problem as childless monarchs. I mean, who is going to take over the system once Blair is out of the picture? Starmer is now sort of playing that junior role, but there's less talent, there's less creativity, there's more of a desire, because these people like Starmer are just kind of bureaucratic men of process by nature. They want to consult the rule book, whereas someone like Blair doesn't feel like he needs to consult any rule book. He's just a creative. The question I have for you is, to what extent can the system self-correct in this Blairite fashion? Because Blair is very flexible. Without Blair himself being at the head of it. It seems to me that so many of our people in Parliament, so many of our people in our elite are just incapable of self-correction because they're very mediocre people with half-baked ideas and half-educated notions and all the rest of it.
I mean, my honest sense, Starmer is a remarkable figure in many ways because I have never seen a politician my entire life who seems to care less about his popularity, what people are saying about him. I mean, was it 10% approval rating, 11%? It's remarkable. I mean, hated on the left, hated on the right. I mean, I don't know if the centre even exists in the country. And yet he marches on, robot-like. Everybody who said, oh, when Mandelson went due to the scandal, everybody said, oh, it's over for this government. Still there. I mean, I just think he's going to ride it out until 2029. And the impression that he's got right from the start is that he's been put in there to do a job, i.e., that he doesn't answer to the people, that he is, I mean, maybe it's directly to Tony Blair, maybe it's just to the permanent, maybe it's just to the system itself. But it seems like this government that we have now is doing an awful lot of the dirty work of the permanent bureaucracy. It's doing really unpopular things. I mean, we can take the issue of digital ID. Wasn't in their manifesto. Wasn't debated. It wasn't, they said when they came to power, we're not going to do it. Then they suddenly announced, yeah, we're going to do it. 4 million people signed a petition. They said, yeah, we're still going to do it. They didn't have a debate.
Yeah.
And now it's going to come in. In fact, it's coming in this month. If you have a business and your board of directors have to be compliant, I think it's coming out. Maybe when this interview goes out, it'll have already happened. So that was a remarkable show of, you know, when I talk about it's top down, I don't think there's ever been a more blatant example of top down decree than the imposition of digital ID. I mean, do you remember a debate? The people weren't, nobody was ever asked, the public were not consulted, there were they didn't even go through the, the process of having the focus groups and so on. What do you think about it?
There was, as I recall, an astroturfed Tony Blair Institute poll saying, "Oh, the masses do love it," but that's talk about marking your own homework.
Yeah, the mafia has polled the mafia, and the mafia agrees that it's the right thing to do,
more or less.
So that's just one issue that you've seen it on, but it seems like across the board. Like, for example, we're going to have this budget coming up. They're going to put up people's taxes. Mm-hmm. Okay, no government wants to put up taxes, but they're already deeply unpopular. They're going to do it anyway. They did digital ID anyway. At the same time, they are also doing other things that may be sorting some issues out that will actually benefit the next government. For example, I know everybody hates the Online Safety Act, but the actual result of the Online Safety Act has been a 77% reduction in porn traffic from Britain on Pornhub. Okay.
Is that so?
Now, if Donald Trump had done that, people would be saying this is a huge victory. Okay?
Yes.
Right? But because it's coming from a very unpopular Labour government, it just kind of passes unnoticed. Legal immigration reduced by 40%. And on the current trajectory, the next set of, it's estimated that they're going to be under 200,000 for next time, okay? Which is a dramatic reduction from the heights of Boris wave, okay? Yes. So a lot of these are difficult jobs for anyone to have done. They'll have already been, some of them will have been done already. As things stand, there's no small boats as well, although I understand that's because there's a hurricane or something, right?
Right.
So they've done less well on then, and I was hoping that he would fix the potholes as well. And as far as I can see, that hasn't happened either.
But definitely hasn't happened.
But what I'm saying is that this government is doing a lot of functional stuff, what must be done, despite what anybody wants. This is like this. So now imagine you get a massive Farage victory, which is projected at the moment, 425 seats. In the excitement of that, both of the major parties have been, democracy has finally worked. Finally the people are in charge. Now we have a champion of the people, Nigel Farage, in power. Now, in my view, reform aren't really that different from the two major parties. I think they wouldn't even be there if they were not, to some extent, already regime compliant and had been vetted. I mean, there have been fairly high profile cases of people who didn't meet their, Rupert Lowe is probably the highest profile example of someone who was deemed unacceptable for whatever reason. So it strikes me that some of the sharper edges of reform have already been cut off. But if they came in and Starmer's already done a lot of this dirty work, which he won't get any credit for, you can see how by, 2032 or something, maybe people are starting to buy back. Now we've got, a popular prime minister. Seems like the immigration line is going in the right way. Seems like in this sort of way, the system could actually eke out a self-correction, if that makes any sense.
I see. And so the self-correction wouldn't be attributable to any magic on the part of the current cabinet, but it would be well, who would be engineering that victory? The system itself?
It would just be. I mean, you have to kind of step outside and see the whole thing in totality. Mm-hmm. It'd be like, well, okay, parliamentary democracy that is this country lives to fight another day.
Right,
okay, and all of the people who watch this show, you won't think it now because at the moment everybody's dismal, everybody's feeling gloomy, and the economy looks like it's on the brink and all of that, and we've got this budget around the corner. But look at America. Okay, I'll give you the example of America. This time, about 18 months ago, there was going to be a civil war, country was going to the dogs, all this sort of stuff. Trump has come in on this massive wave. He's got everybody excited. And now, functionally, you've got lots and lots and lots of people who were very harsh critics of the American system who have been turned into cheerleaders for Donald Trump. Literally cheerleaders for the American government. Now, in my view, objectively, very little has actually changed. It's the same country. If you were Vladimir Putin sitting in the Kremlin, from his point of view, or from the KGB's point of view or something, you're still dealing with the American government at the end of the day. Nothing has really changed. But the perception is that there have been dramatic changes. And sometimes that's enough. Yes. And as far as I know, Trump hit record military recruitment, to come back to my earlier point.
Yes.
So in a way, now you've got some people, lots of people, buying back into the system. Now there are still divisions and rifts in MAGA. There's always drama around Donald Trump. He hasn't been perfect. I'd be the first one to tell you that. But the fact is that a lot of people are back on the reservation. And from the point of view of the system itself, that is the thing that matters.
How does the right go about, in Britain, in the British context, go about then scoring some political victories without becoming victims of their own Pyrrhic success, in a way? Like, what is this? What is the strategy for outmaneuvering the playbook you're describing for the right?
Well, I mean, my advice would be to not make the victories Pyrrhic. One of the reasons that we still talk about Tony Blair is that he made permanent, lasting structural change, and he embedded into the system essentially I hate to get all Marxist on you, but the reproduction of himself, the reproduction of his own ideological apparatus. I'm going to set up all these independent bodies and stuff them full of Blairites, who are then going to train more Blairites. So that now, I mean, he hasn't been in office since 2007, and still everybody recognizes that the system that we live under is recognizably the managerial apparatus that he helped establish. I would say that it's a little bit of an oversimplification to attribute all of this to Blair, because a large part of the apparatus was actually built up under Thatcher, who famously said that her heir was Blair.
Yes.
Okay. Another thing, very quickly to mention on this topic, is that a lot of the things the New Labour did was actually just consolidate laws that were already on the books. So, it's a nice shorthand for us to say before and after Blair. But actually what that government did was formalise a lot of stuff that was already there piecemeal and bring them under one big kind of umbrella. A good example is Ofcom. If you look at the history of Ofcom, it was several different bodies that were all doing the same functions. What Labour did was bring them all under one roof and under one central administration. Another good example is the Equality Act of 2010. the actual hate speech law, I think, was written in 1986.
It's the Public Order Act 84, I think, yes.
Right. But there was a lot of other discrimination laws that were on the books, one for sex and one for race and so on.
That's right.
And what Labour did is that they just brought them all together in one super bill, almost as a kind of work of managerial efficiency. And they formalised it and made it more visible. But in a way, you just go back and watch old episodes of Yes Minister to see that Blair did not invent the managerial state that exists. I mean, you can go back and read George Orwell. It's all there in the 40s as well. So, but anyway, to come back to the point, what I'd recommend. Okay, so when Nigel Farage becomes the Prime Minister, as far as I understand it, in this country there are almost no American-style checks and balances to the wielding of parliamentary power if you have a majority. Herbert Spencer called it the divine right of Parliament. It's funny, I was walking here, I saw the statue of Cromwell, and I was thinking, yes, maybe he'll come up, okay? But the divine right of Parliament. So, in theory, there is actually nothing stopping Farage coming in and truly enacting, he could just call it the Repeal Blair Act or something. In one act, we could get rid of the Supreme Court. We could get rid of the Communications Act. We could get, completely reform or strip out Ofcom. All of these things, we could...
flood the House of Lords.
Yes. Put the House of Lords back to how it used to be. Or, he could basically do anything he wanted to. So there's a huge opportunity, if this reform government comes in, to create lasting change. But in order to do that, they have to be serious, and they have to have a plan to make sure their victories are permanent and not Pyrrhic. When I say permanent, I don't mean forever, but lasting 40, 50 years. Me, I'm an optimist. I don't really see that will in reform. I see them generally being safe and playing by the old rules. And unless Nigel is playing the mother of all hide your power levels, I just don't see him doing any of that.
Eric Kaufman, in his book, his recent book, Taboo, says that left liberalism, as he puts it, is characterized by three rough opinions. One is that white guilt is an appropriate emotion. Two, that minorities merit special adoration. And three was a concept that he calls fascist scare, this kind of over-egged fear that if the right scores any victories whatsoever, before you know it, you're back in apartheid South Africa, or you're in the Fourth Reich is upon us, and all this sort of, frankly, hyperventilating about equating cultural conservatism with just Nazism as such, or stuff like that. In your view, has the right internalized a lot of this without noticing, and are many of the upper echelons in reform guilty of that?
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's necessarily what's going through their mind, i.e. if they use power, therefore fascism or something like that.
Right.
I actually think that the real root of it may be because they're all classical liberals and Thatcherites who equate the use of state power with doing bad in some way. But the fact of the matter is that you have to take the chance when you're in power. I mean, Boris Johnson could have done all of the things that I just mentioned, and he just chose not to. So if this government, if the reform government is going to mean anything, they have to actually wield the power they've got. And you could even frame everything I've said in a classical liberal way. You could say, well, what we're actually doing is shrinking the state, just repealing all of these horrible things that have built up, over the past 20 or 30 years. First by the Blair government, then by the risible 14 years of betrayal. He could easily sell it to the country, he could actually sell it as I'm doing Gladstone.
Yes,
Gladstone, famous. I can't remember how many. He just repealed tens of thousands of laws in one day. One of the greatest kind of liberal acts ever. So they could easily find an ideological frame to sell it. whether they're going to do so or not remains to be. I don't really see that vigor and that willingness to, because it's going to take some courage to face down permanent bureaucracy. I mean, we talk about Blair as this kind of like, left Caesar figure, but in truth, even he came up against serious limits for what he was able to achieve when he was prime minister. For example, Blair actually talked about changing the Geneva Convention because they were having an asylum and immigration crisis back then.
Yes.
And he made arguments while he was the prime minister saying like, look, these conventions came about after World War II. The conditions have changed. We need to change them.
He's right.
Even Blair was not able to achieve that. So
I think it's in his 2010 memoir, A Journey. He talks about how the European Convention on Human Rights and the UN Refugee Convention were outdated because their context, as he puts it, was firmly that of 1930s Germany, and we now live in an age of global intercontinental migration in which you're going to be up against many orders of magnitude more bogus asylum claims and all the rest of it. So yeah, he did have a very admirable flexibility in all of these respects. But yes, so back to Farage and whether he is capable of making sure that the victories are not just Pyrrhic. Let's try and get into his mentality a bit. I mean, you've already been doing it a little bit there, but maybe this will be a useful framing. Who would you say is more enthralled by the Boomer Truth regime? Define that as well in your answer. Reform UK in its current form, or the Tories?
I mean, they're both pretty. Both. I mean, let's put it a different way.
Right.
I think that the left, as they stand, likes of Starmer and even Blair himself and some of these figures, are actually less in thrall to that idea than the Tories as they have been for the past 14 years, and by Farage and Tice and so on, who seem to me to be just another, I mean, from where I'm looking, they just look like another flavour of the Tories. They're just like a slight rebranding with a slightly different shade of blue.
Yes.
Which is why I think that it's inevitable that we're going to get some sort of merger down the line.
Do you think that will happen?
I mean, unless you get the scenario that I've laid out before of the Tory party suddenly becoming a truly conservative party under somebody like Rupert Lowe, flanking, becoming what people want Farage to be, taking all the energy from that. And I only think Rupert Lowe is the only person realistically who's on the board who could do it right now. Unless that scenario plays out, which is looking less and likely as time goes on, all the momentum is with Farage. It will only be a matter of time before figures within the Tory party, and I'm sure it's already happened. I've already seen Jacob Rees-Mogg telling people to vote Reform. It will only be a matter of time before people say, well, look, Reform don't really have an apparatus. They don't have an infrastructure. We've got an infrastructure that's been that we're literally the most successful political party of all time. You're going to need people for this cabinet. You're going to need expertise. You're going to need people on the ground. Realistically, you kind of need the Tory machine. So we'll make it the Reform Tory party. I mean, maybe it will be such that it gets a new date. It'll be like when the old Tories became the Conservatives, something like that. So maybe on Wikipedia, you'll get a new founded date. But essentially, it will just be the continuation, because structurally it's necessary. And this is something else. Remember, I talked about 0 seats. Tony Blair's My Journey. He talked about in 1997 how he hoped that he hadn't wiped the Tories out because he recognised how much they need the Tory party. And Labour people now have started talking about, hold on a second, it's like, reminds me of like Joker and the Batman.
Right, yes.
Right, when Batman has a chance in one of the comic books of killing the Joker, Joker says, look, you can't do it. You need me. You're nothing with it. So, and he doesn't do, and it's true. And so in a way, even if it becomes Reform versus Green, it's just going to end up in Tory, because the system needs it. It needs the the back and forth, the Punch and Judy show, the stakes of red versus blue or whatever it is, to get people invested in that being the game, as opposed to, looking at the system itself, or the kind of the managerial class as we call them. So I think it's kind of inevitable that down the line that will happen.
So when you talk about the Boomer Truth regime, I see you as describing a kind of a meta-political situation, a kind of mythology that is infuses everyone's operating system in society, but which, in your view, and I think in mine too, insofar as I've understood you, regard as inducing a kind of strange kind of civilizational psychosis. It prevents us from seeing things as they truly are. And so what I was going to say on that front is I would argue that one of the linchpins, and maybe you'd agree, of the Boomer Truth regime is that, I remember Tracy B. Strong, the philosopher, he once said, one of the major things about post-war liberalism is that they think that post-war liberals realize that politics is necessary, but they don't want it ever to get too serious. I think that's what Tracy B. Strong says. And it's perfectly understandable that people shouldn't want to live in a world of absolute politics. There are other interesting things that go on in life, but the tragedy of politics, and Schmitt is one of the clearest thinkers on this in the concept of the political, is that we are not always at liberty to choose what is political and what is not political, because we may find that we are implicated in the political interests of others. Because people like Farage do run on this very anti-political Boomer Truth regime psychology in a way, I think that it makes them incapable of wielding power and engaging in executive concerted action. Because in an ideal world, conservatives would just be, small government conservatives. It would be much more agreeable to live in a world in which that was a plausible playbook, but that's not where we find ourselves. And how are we going to rouse someone like Farage from that unless there is more competition on the right? Because at the moment, he's hoovering up all of the attention and he seems inevitable.
Yeah, I should probably define this Boomer Truth regime. The way I picture it is always the two figures of John Lennon and Winston Churchill side by side doing that, okay? John Lennon doing it for peace, and Churchill doing it the V for victory sign, okay? Yes. What that means is that the ultimate good in any society is defined by the terms of John Lennon's Imagine, okay, where you're imagining a world without countries and without religions, but what it really is no constraints on individual self-expression, no constraints. If you want to call yourself a woman, Harrison, who am I to tell you otherwise? Okay, I don't want to put any constraints on how you identify yourself, what you can possibly, however you want to express yourself. That is actually the summum bonum. That is good, okay? And if I take even one step towards constraining your unlimited ability to express yourself, it's directly to Hitler. Do not pass £200. Do not pass go. You're automatically then Hitler if you say anything about that. And that is, in a nutshell, the Boomer Truth regime. Yes. Okay, yes. It's not anything to do with the historical figure of Churchill or Hitler or even the Beatles. Yeah. It is literally just this paradigm where that you cannot say anything about the John Lennon vision without being accused of being a fascist.
Yes.
And we've seen we've kind of seen where this goes. And see, the bizarre thing with Farage is that he kind of doesn't do any of these things, and yet they call him those names anyway.
Right.
Which has always been. I've always wondered when you play the game of apology. Okay, right. I apologize. I'm sorry. I took one step. In the wrong direction, and I've sinned and so on. Like we've seen over the past 10 years that never actually results in them stopping calling you names. It never stops them coming back and calling him, the same set of names the next news cycle over. And what was it for all his other faults, one thing that Trump did do, which was refreshing and interesting, was he just punched back. He just said, look, I don't care what you call me, and I'm going to come back 100 times harder on you. And I think what a lot of people wish for, I don't know if I wish for it, but objectively, a lot of people wish for is some of that spunk in Nigel and in form. But I just don't really see it. I don't really see it.
But it would require us to drop the pretense that we don't live in an age of absolute politics when increasingly we do. The reason why I think right-wing Thatcherism is practicable under the Boomer Truth regime is because she can couch it in precisely those individualist terms. She can say, no, I'm not politicizing this situation. This has been Britain's economy has already been politicized by the trade unions. I'm simply kicking it back to civil society. And so she can frame what she's doing as an anti-political onslaught, because our challenges today are not well answered by government isn't the solution to the problem, government is the problem, because that doesn't really work today. We actually do need to wield power. The right's post-war, it's been permitted a certain amount of like economic individualism in the post-war era because that seems non-Hitlerian. But as soon as you start needing to engage in cultural onslaughts of your own or political onslaughts of your own, that does register as to taking us in the direction of the Fourth Reich and all the rest of it. And so it seems to me that let's maybe get to Lowe now. Like Rupert Lowe, I see one of the major virtues of Lowe potentially leading the Conservative Party, that it would prevent Farage from being as complacent as he is at the moment. And what you might see is actually quite a virtuous right-wing arms race in which both Reform and the Tories feel a pressing need to outbid one another from the right.
Pivotally, Harrison, tactically speaking, it prevents the inevitable merger.
That's also true.
Which is then also denies Reform the machinery they would inherit, because the Reform, like in that merger, basically what's happening is Tories gain Reform votes,
yes,
by proxy. Reform gain the apparatus and the history and the buildings and all of that sort of stuff, which they're not nothing. There's significant
appeal on both sides,
cultural and political capital. And I also think that Farage, on a personal level, has always been motivated slightly by wanting some sort of acceptance into that world as well. So there's all sorts of carrots they could dangle there. But if they stick Rupert in there, they're not going to make up.
That's true. It makes it more or less impossible on that front. I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms. What chances do you give Rupert Lowe of being able to make a compelling bid to the Tories? We're talking earlier about the extent to which elites are incapable of self-correction or may be capable of self-correction. Tories have historically shown great staying power and survivability. They can adapt. Do you see the Tory party today as a beast that can still do that sort of thing? Or are they just going to end up getting rid of Kemi and replacing her with James Cleverly, in which case, what are we doing?
Let's just tell it like it is here. The issue they've got is they've got Lord Heseltine, literally the age of 92 or something now, still standing there and saying this is unacceptable. He said this is unacceptable descent into fascism, blah, 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 blah. Can't allow it to happen. And John Major there, sickness. These people are in a different world. They're just in a different world. So, and so what has to happen, I hate to say it, is that the old guard at some point just need to let go.
Yes.
We're seeing it in America as well. We're seeing it everywhere. The boomers at some point have to retire. And I don't even know what generation Heseltine is.
He might even be older than Boomer, to be frank.
I was about 5 years old when he was in government. But he's still, my point is, he's still there and he's still acting as a barrier to any of these kind of necessary changes happening. So that's what's going to have to happen. It has happened before, though. Thatcher did do it. Thatcher basically overturned there was like a generational turnover within the Tory party in the 1970s. So it is theoretically possible. But then, see, even if they overcome, so Heseltine is also, he'd not only be a barrier to Rupert coming in, Heseltine would also be a barrier to any merger with Reform. So it kind of, so in either case, that situation has to be dealt with like pretty quickly. They're going to have to, I don't know who it would be. It would have to probably be somebody of Michael Gove's generation, probably, to make the appeal. I guess the Gen Xers are going to have to make the appeal to the old guard. Like, look, if we don't do this, we are going to destroy the oldest and most successful political party in history of any country. 300, 400 years of history down the drain. For what? For the fact that you thought this was unpalatable.
Yes.
And if they see it as a betrayal of their principles, then you could say, well, this is in the greatest Tory tradition of betraying all our principles.
From the Corn Laws onwards.
Yeah, from the Corn Laws onwards. I don't need to go down the, expansion of the franchise, you name it.
Yes, yeah, no, they do have a congenital form on this score. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so let me then ask this: one other major problem with the potential problem with the Lowe strategy, and this is the last thing I'll ask you, is that even someone as brilliant as Lowe, with independence of mind and frankly, I mean, I know him, full disclosure, I'm a policy fellow at Restore Britain, and he genuinely does not care what people think about him, which is a real strength. He really doesn't. He's very polite and courteous, but he doesn't care, which is always a good sign. Would even someone as brilliant as him be able to save the Tory party at this point? Because they are up and down the nation, institutionally, just going to be associated with betrayal, particularly in those red wall seats that gambled on them in 2020. And got very little for it, in fact, got less than little for it, got an even more wrecked civilization for it. So is it even salvageable optically?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that you can achieve a lot with the change of scenery, with the change of cast of characters. If Rupert does it, he has to bring in different cast of characters. He's not going to be able to do it with people associated with the old government, which could be a problem, a personnel issue. It's going to have to be cemented in the mind of the voter that they are a different proposition, and not only a different proposition, but the real deal. Unlike Farage, who's a fake.
Neema Parvini, academic agent. Thank you for joining me.